The mist rolled heavy and low over the banks of the Susquehanna River, crawling like a living thing through the reeds and over the wheels of the wagon that creaked its slow way down the muddy slope, where every inch forward felt like dragging the weight of old grief across a new world. Jacob Lapp, his tall frame hunched forward with the strain of the reins, peered into the shrouded woods ahead, his eyes trained not on the path but on the spaces between the trees, where too much silence lingered for his comfort. Behind him sat his wife Elizabeth, her hands wrapped tightly around the sleeping form of their youngest child, her face pale but alert, while their two older children, Daniel, 9, and Anna, 7, watched through slats in the wagon's wooden sides with a quiet too deep for their age. They had heard the stories. Not of wild beasts or war parties, but of a kind of wilderness that didn't want to be touched, that grew thick and shadowed not by accident but by intention, and as they passed deeper into the Pennsylvania backwoods, even the birds seemed to hold their breath. What lay ahead was not simply a clearing, nor a promised patch of fertile ground, it was a frontier in every sense of the word, a place with no churches or city bells, no kings or taxes, no markers of man's dominion, just land, raw and waiting, humming with its own voice beneath the brush and birch. Jacob tightened his grip on the reins, not out of fear but out of reverence, knowing that what they were doing now would echo in generations to come. For Jacob and the 5 other Amish families who had left the war-torn Palatinate months before, every rattle of the wagon wheels was a line drawn between the old world and the new, between persecution and providence. They had arrived in Philadelphia in the early spring, their ship battered but afloat, their spirits weathered but intact, and they had wasted no time pressing westward, their destination a place known only by word of mouth among their Anabaptist brethren, Conestoga Creek, said to lie nestled between gentle hills and rich with soil untouched by plow or priest, where the land rolled open like a quilt waiting to be sewn. They passed English settlements along the way, bustling towns full of strange customs and louder voices, but they avoided them with careful detours, wary of being drawn into worldly temptations or conscripted into wars not their own. Nights were spent huddled in meadows under cloaks, cooking thin broth over shared fires and reading aloud from worn pages of the Bible in hushed tones, children asleep at their feet, adults staring into the flames as though the answers they sought might rise from the embers. When they reached the edge of the creek at last, it did not feel like an arrival but an encounter, between them and something ancient, quiet, watching. The water ran black beneath a sky of ash, and the surrounding trees bent as if whispering among themselves. There were no fences, no footpaths, no signs that any had come before, though Jacob felt, deeply and without words, that they were not the first to stand there with pounding hearts. The caravan halted, the men stepping down first, their boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, their eyes scanning the ridges as the silence pressed in. Elizabeth stepped down last, her feet landing gently, her fingers still gripping her sleeping child, and when she looked around, she said softly, "It is beautiful, but not empty." No one replied. They knew what she meant. Within hours, they had begun to build. One communal cabin would do for the first winter, or walls raised by 6 sets of hands, roofs thatched with branches and sealed with pitch, floorboards cut from nearby trees that creaked and whispered underfoot. The men worked from dawn until moonlight, there. Shirts soaked and hands calloused, while the women smoked meat, dried apples, and hummed hymns under their breath as they worked the fires. Children gathered sticks and hauled buckets from the creek, sometimes stopping to watch the trees sway with no wind. Jacob took it upon himself to record their journey in a leather-bound journal, not as a history for others but as a confession to God, his entries raw and without pretense. "We have come," he wrote on the 7th day, "to a place where even the silence has weight. The children do not laugh freely. The wind waits too long before moving. Yet I feel the Lord's hand here." The first frost came early that year, biting into the marrow of the trees and turning their breath to steam by sundown. Food grew scarce. They rationed flour, ground corn into bitter cakes, and boiled roots that tasted of soil and grit. But none complained. The Ordnung bound them tightly, reminding them that hardship was not punishment but preparation. At night, the cabin glowed with a single lantern, and Jacob read aloud from the book of Psalms, his voice trembling but firm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Yet the fear came, not loud or sudden, but slow and creeping, like the frost inching down the window panes. Tracks appeared near the well, barefoot, human-sized, but with toes that looked too long, as if drawn by a child trying to mimic a man. At first, Jacob thought it nonsense. Perhaps children had wandered. Perhaps raccoons. Perhaps nothing. But when the dogs refused to bark at night, their bodies stiff and eyes locked on the tree line, when Elizabeth woke Jacob trembling because she had heard singing outside, a melody in a minor key, slow and unfamiliar, Jacob sat up and did not sleep again that night. He did not share his fear with the others. Instead, he asked the elders to pray more often, and they did, gathering in the cold with bowed heads, asking God not just for warmth or food but for protection. Still, the whispers came. One child, Lee, Anna from the Fisher family, said she had seen someone near the woods, not a man, not a woman, but a figure with a shawl pulled tight and eyes that glinted like glass. Jacob told her she must have been dreaming. But the next morning, they found a doll outside the door made from straw and pine twine, its arms twisted, its eyes hollow holes burned into the bark of a walnut shell. Jacob took the doll and threw it into the fire, saying nothing. December snow turned the ground white, but the air held no peace. Elizabeth awoke one night screaming that the baby had been taken, though the child slept soundly in her arms. Jacob soothed her, but the terror in her eyes lingered for days. Others reported strange dreams, of being pulled into the forest, of hearing German spoken by unseen mouths, of bells ringing underwater. One man, Brother Reef, claimed he had walked into the woods one afternoon and could not find his way back for hours, though he had only gone a few hundred feet. When he returned, his boots were wet, though there had been no snow where he'd gone, and his left sleeve was torn as if by thorn or claw. Still, they endured. Jacob wrote in his journal, "The Lord does not promise us ease. He promises us purpose. And if we are tested here, then let us be found faithful." He began to fast 3 days a week, drinking only broth, his body thinning, his beard growing longer. When the elders noticed, they did not interfere. They too had begun to feel the presence, an invisible scrutiny from beyond the trees, not hostile, but not welcoming either. In January, a terrible wind came, not from the north, but from beneath, or so it seemed, curling up through the floorboards and making the lanterns flicker in unnatural rhythms. That night, all 6 families gathered in the cabin, crowding the small space with blankets, psalm books, and whispered prayers. The children clung to their parents, and the adults kept one eye on the windows. They heard creaking outside, as if the trees were bending farther than wind could push. Then came the sound of laughter, high, echoing, faint. No one spoke of it the next morning. Jacob simply took his axe and walked the perimeter of their clearing, marking the trees with carved crosses. When Elizabeth asked him if it would help, he replied only, "It will remind them we are not afraid." By late February, the snow began to melt, and the first buds of spring dared to show their faces. The silence remained, but it had changed. It no longer watched, only lingered. Jacob gathered the children and taught them how to plant rows. The women sang again, and their voices seemed to push back the heavy air. One morning, a deer walked calmly into their clearing, stood at the well, and drank before retreating. That night, no one dreamed badly. Jacob closed his journal that week with one final line for the season: "We have not been cast out. We have been allowed to stay." Spring in the Conestoga brought a cautious kind of beauty, like a smile from a stranger whose history you cannot guess, and for the Amish settlers, it marked the first true breath of hope after a winter spent locked in silence and shadow. The frost retreated like a beaten enemy, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the snow, and one by one, green shoots pierced the surface as if even the soil itself wished to forget the cold. Wild flowers dotted the banks of the creek, small bursts of yellow and blue nestled in the grass, and the air changed, no longer pressing and heavy, but lighter, filled with birdsong and the buzz of things coming back to life. Jacob Lapp stood at the edge of the fields with his son Daniel, now 10, and showed him how to test the moisture of the soil with his fingers, how to smell the wind and know if it would carry rain or drought. The boy nodded solemnly, listening with an attentiveness that surpassed his years, and Jacob, looking into his son's eyes, saw a kind of steadiness that reminded him of the great oak they had felled that winter, tall and rooted deep. Across the small clearing, Elizabeth knelt with Anna and a few other girls, reading from the book of Psalms in the morning sun, the sound of her voice blending with the breeze in a harmony that made even the wind seem reverent. They had begun to build new homes, one for each family, shaping them in the same style as the ones left behind in the Palatinate, timber-framed with steep roofs and shuttered windows, modest but sturdy, made not just to shelter bodies but to hold the way of life safe from the world's chaos. The fields were cleared with oxen and willpower, and in the silence of the plows carving long furrows through virgin earth, there was a kind of sacred rhythm, the scrape of wood, the breath of animals, the low hum of voices praying without speaking. It was, for a time, peace, but peace, Jacob would later write, is not the absence of trouble, but the illusion that trouble has passed by. The first blow came quietly, like all true tests do, a slow sickness among the livestock, starting with the goats, who began to limp and lay down in strange positions, their eyes glassy and mouths slack. Then the cows began to bleed from the nose, and soon, 3 entire families had lost their animals, the foundation of their sustenance and trade. Jacob and the elders searched for causes. They examined the hay, tested the well water, even wondered if wolves or hidden diseases from the forest had cursed the animals. But no cause was found, and in the vacuum of answers, suspicion crept in. Was it a sign from God? A punishment for hidden sins? Or had they somehow broken the delicate balance of this land by building where they were not meant to? The community pulled tighter together, but beneath the unity was unease. The afflicted families were helped, food shared, tasks redistributed, but the questions remained, unspoken yet thick in the air. Then came the Nook. Omer. He arrived one evening on foot, coming from the northern woodline just as the sun dipped below the ridge, a man of perhaps 30, with dark hair, a short beard, and clothes that did not match. His speech was half German, but with the soft R's of Lutheran heritage, and he claimed to be a wanderer seeking fellowship among his brothers of the faith. He was not turned away, not immediately, for hospitality was sacred, but Jacob and the elders watched him closely. He walked with a certain swagger, his boots polished, his shirt lined with silver thread, and he carried a coin pouch that clinked too loudly for a man who claimed to be poor. Most troubling of all, he did not seem to understand or respect the ordinal. He used tobacco, whistled tunes from taverns, and once, Elizabeth whispered, she caught him staring too long at the unmarried girls with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The final straw came when he asked to court Lise, the 17-year-old daughter of Brother Danner, without having first spoken to the elders, without requesting a blessing, and without even knowing the details of her baptism. That night, the elders gathered by torchlight in Jacob's barn, their faces grave and weathered. If we bend, we break, said Brother Reef. But if we cast out too many, we fall alone, countered another. Jacob listened, then spoke softly, this is not about the man. It is about the pattern. The ordnung is our spine. If it is broken, we become something else. And so, the man was asked to leave. He did so without resistance, but not without words. As he stood at the edge of the settlement, pack in hand, he turned to Jacob and said in a low voice, you think this place is yours. But something else is here. It always was. Then he vanished into the woods, his footsteps swallowed by the trees. After that, the rain stopped. Days stretched under a blazing sun, the sky cloudless and cruel, and the fields began to crack. Corn shriveled on the stalk. Cabbage leaves yellowed and curled. The women knelt in the fields each morning, their hands outstretched, praying aloud in thick dialects, their voices shaking not from doubt but desperation. Jacob continued to work, hauling water, fixing fences, but his body began to fail. One afternoon, he collapsed near the creek, feverish and unable to stand, his skin hot and dry. For 2 days he lay in bed, Elizabeth wiping his brow with cloths soaked in vinegar and well water, whispering prayers into his ear, holding his hand as if she could keep his soul from wandering. Children grew thinner, tempers flared, and the forest began to look less like a boundary and more like an invitation. Then came the bell. It had been forged from scrap iron the previous fall, a symbol of unity and vigilance, mounted atop a small frame near the central path, meant to call for prayer or warn of fire. On a night of no moon, when the stars themselves seemed unsure if they should shine, the bell rang 3 times. Loud. Clear. Slow. Everyone woke. They gathered at their doors, lanterns in hand, eyes wide and locked on the bell, which swayed gently though no wind stirred. No one stood near it. No rope had moved. Jacob, still weak, was helped to the door by Daniel, and he watched the bell until it stilled. The next morning, a cross was found on the path near the creek, burned into the ground with precision, its edges charred and black, as if branded by something hot and deliberate. A meeting was held. The elders argued in low voices. Some wanted to leave. Others to move deeper into the wilderness, to start again. But Jacob stood and spoke plainly, the devil tempts with fear. But we must answer with light. If we run, we take the darkness with us. If we stay, we may turn it back. That night, the community gathered in the clearing. They lit lanterns and placed them in a circle. They held hands and sang hymns in unison, old German songs of steadfastness and grace, their voices rising above the trees like smoke from a holy fire. The Why read from Matthew, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." There was no miracle. No thunderbolt. No revelation. But the next morning, the sky had changed. Gray clouds rolled in from the west, and by afternoon it rained. A long, slow rain that soaked the earth and filled the barrels, that softened the cracked soil and brought worms wriggling to the surface. Crops revived. The children danced in the puddles. The livestock grew strong again. And the tracks near the creek, whatever had made them, were never seen again. By the year 1743, the wilderness that had once loomed like a wall of teeth around the Amish settlers had softened, tamed not by conquest but by patience. And what had begun as a clearing carved by trembling hands in an unforgiving forest had grown into a village of quiet strength and sacred order. Gone were the shared shelters of desperate winter, replaced now with timber-framed homes that stood like upright prayers. Their sloped roofs dark with rain and their shutters trimmed by the careful hands of men who measured not just wood but righteousness with every cut. The fields rolled outward in tidy rows of corn, barley, and cabbage, the soil turned rich and dark by seasons of labor and faith, and in the early morning light, the land shimmered as if blessed by the breath of heaven itself. Here and there, wooden barns rose with simple elegance, their beams fastened without nails, held together by joinery and the covenant of trust, and inside them echoed the laughter of children, the clink of milk pails, the lowing of cows who now walked the same land their calves would be born into. Hofnungstal, the Valley of Hope, they called it, not with pride, but with reverent gratitude, for the name itself felt like a hymn, whispered from one soul to another, a word that gathered all their suffering and sanctified it into something beautiful. Jacob laughed, who had once held the reins that first brought them through the mists of Conestoga Creek, now walked the paths between homes with slower steps and a bare. These streaked with gray, his hands still callous but gentler, his eyes deep wells that held years of unspoken memories, of winter nights when the bell rang without cause, of whispering trees and tracks that no creature should make, of burnt crosses and dreams that left a man weeping without knowing why. But those things were no longer spoken of, not because they were forgotten, but because silence itself had become a kind of pact, a sacred veil drawn between the past and the present, between fear and peace. The community had endured not by confronting the darkness, but by refusing to give it power through repetition, and in that silence, they found strength, a quiet resilience that no outsider could quite understand. The children grew, born not in exile like their parents but in rooted soil, and a one-room schoolhouse was built near the eastern edge of the village, its single door always open during lessons, not for air but for honesty, and within its whitewashed walls, the children learned to read and write in Hochdeutsch, to recite psalms by heart, and to carry the ordnung not as a burden but as a compass. The teacher was a young woman named Ruth, barely 19 but steady as stone, who walked the path to the school each morning with a slate under one arm and her black bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin. She taught not just arithmetic and scripture but the art of listening, not to one another, but to the land, the wind, the silence between sentences, and the children, wide-eyed and barefoot, sat at their desks carved from walnut and listened not because they were told to, but because they felt something holy in her presence. Among them was a boy named Matthias, 8 years old, with dark, still eyes and a habit of pausing too long before speaking, as though measuring each word for weight and consequence. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the open shutters and thus tea danced in the golden light, Matthias raised his hand and asked Ruth, "If silence is holy, why do the trees whisper?" A question so pure and precise that Ruth could only smile, as did the elders. When the story was told to them later that evening, for in that one question was the heart of everything they had come to believe, that God was in the quiet, yes, but that He allowed the world to speak softly, like a mother humming over a cradle, and the trees, well, perhaps they whispered not warnings, but prayers. The world beyond Hofnungstal did not vanish, it remained a shadow at the edge of their world, sometimes drawing near, sometimes receding, but always watching. Once a year, a wagon from Lancaster arrived, driven by an English trader named Whitlock, who wore bright vests and smelled of smoke and horses, and though he greeted the Amish with theatrical bows and crooked smiles, he respected their ways enough to trade fairly, offering salt, iron tools, cloth, and books in exchange for baskets, cheeses, and wool. The children watched him with awe, for he told stories of distant towns where men shouted in markets and women painted their faces and carriages rolled without horses. And though Ruth warned the children to be wary of the English tongue that speaks quickly but means slowly, they listened anyway, wide-eyed and secretly curious. Occasionally, other visitors came, missionaries, land agents, soldiers, but they were met with polite nods and firm refusals. When one English captain tried to conscript young men for militia service, Jacob stood before him with the ordnung folded neatly in his hand and said, "We will serve no kingdom but God's." And when the captain laughed, Elizabeth stepped forward and said, "There is a silence that speaks louder than orders," and the captain left, unsettled. Word spread, as it always does, carried by traders and whispers, and soon more Amish families began to arrive, barefoot and worn thin by the weight of war and poverty, their wagons sagging under the burden of what little they had salvaged. They came from the Carolinas, from the outskirts of New York, from distant German villages torn by religious fracture, and each was welcomed not with banners or feasts, but with work, because in Hofnungstal, hospitality was measured by the hands that helped raise your barn, not the mouth that offered words. Jacob oversaw the expansion carefully, ensuring that the ordnung remained untouched, that no additions compromised the quiet fabric they had woven, and in time, he passed his journal, now bound in cracked leather and soft from years of use, to the eldest among the newcomers, who read it aloud by lantern light as others wept. It became known as thy word Imshatan, the words in the shadows, not because it spoke of darkness, but because it taught how to live faithfully within it, how to survive not by erasing fear but by walking through it with your head bowed and your heart open. Jacob grew older, his steps slower, but his presence never diminished. He no longer chopped wood or mended fences, but he sat often in the shade of the old oak that stood at the village center, watching the children play, greeting each passerby with a nod and a blessing. The younger men still sought his counsel, not for decisions, those now belonged to others, but for the weight of his silence, for the way he would close his eyes when a question was asked and seem to hear something deeper before speaking. When asked once by a boy if he feared death, Jacob smiled faintly and said, I feared being forgotten. But now I know, even silence remembers. When he died in the winter of 1751, it was not with drama or grief, but with reverence. The entire village gathered in the meeting house, the windows unshuttered so the wind could hear, and Ruth read aloud from his journal while the others sat in perfect stillness. He was buried at the edge of the forest, not with a gravestone, but with a small wooden cross carved by Daniel, now a man with children of his own, and no one spoke as the soil fell onto the pine box, because Jacob had taught them that some goodbyes are too holy for words. And though none of them ever spoke it aloud, not in public, not even in whispers by the fire, all remembered that first winter, that first cabin, the silence that had once hung so thick it felt like breath held by the land itself. They remembered the black-cloaked figures glimpsed beyond the tree line, the footprints that circled their well but left no name, the bell that rang on a night of no moon, and the cross burned into the path like a scar. Those things were never mentioned to newcomers, never taught in school or written in church records, because they were not stories, they were warnings etched into the marrow of those who had lived them. Silence had not been their defense, it had been their covenant. A pact between them and the land, between the past and the present, between what could be explained and what should never be. They were no longer wanderers, no longer just survivors of war or persecution, they had become stewards of something sacred, guardians of a quiet that healed, shaped, and protected. And when the wind rustled the trees in just the right way, with a rhythm like breath and memory, the elders would glance up and nod slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, because they knew the land still watched, and they, in return, still listened.